Hey everybody, welcome to part two of lecture number one about World War One. We're going to continue on here and if we get through it, we get through it. But let's talk about nationalism a little bit more because nationalism truly is one of the driving forces of this conflict. So, nationalism, as I said before, is intense pride and loyalty to one's nation. Your nation can do no wrong. And as I also alluded to in the previous part of the lecture, you see this nationalism movement manifest itself through the unification of Germany and Italy in the 19th century. This was, hey, we're all Germans, let's come together. Yeah, you're from Bavaria and you're from Prussia, but we're still all Germans. And so let's create Germany, a unified, powerful Germany. Same thing with Italy. And, you know, this nationalism, nationalism is not good. Let's just say it. It's not good. Nationalism blinds people to the problems that are going on in their nation. Now, within the Balkans, where we had the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, one of the things that had happened is the Balkans were kind of being administered by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottoman Empire, and that's what we're talking down about around Turkey when we talk about the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. As the Ottoman Empire started to lose power and steam, you start to see a transition to Balkan nationalism. And the idea, and especially Serbia, is going to be a huge leader in this, that they are going to want to create their own sort of nation. And that's when I talked about that tripartite solution of creating an Austro-Hungarian Balkan Empire. Now, this tripartite solution may not have satiated the Serbians, but it certainly would have been a step toward what they were trying to accomplish. But for many Serbians, they wanted to create a greater Serbia and basically have Serbia take over the Balkan region. Because of this, there were lots of fears in the Austro-Hungarian Empire of sort of Serbian nationalism, but also broader Slavic nationalism. And when I say Slavic, okay, well, if you don't know what a Slavic person is, it is typically associated with Russia and the Balkans. It is just like Caucasian is a type of European, or you have someone of Hispanic descent. Slavic descent is its very own thing. And the Slavs will also be victims in World War II of Nazi aggression. The Nazis will not like Slavs, and they will also be part of the Holocaust. As well as Jews, obviously. But there is this fear that is growing in these countries about this power that Serbia potentially wields. And so much power that Serbia has, as we previously mentioned, an alliance with Russia. Now, Russia may not be the best country to have an alliance with. They're kind of technologically backwards. But the same thing can be said for World War I that can be said for World War II. While Russia lacks in technology, it makes up for in people. Has lots of people. So, now, amongst the greater powers, you are going to have rivalries between these bigger European countries. There was a Franco-German rivalry, France versus Germany, after the Franco-Prussian War. Part of this will be over a piece of territory called Alsace-Lorraine, which the Germans will have control of until the end of World War I, and then that same area will become point of contention during World War II. The Brits and the Germans have a naval rivalry. They're both trying to build up huge navies. As I mentioned before, they've got colonies throughout the world. The Germans, for instance. The reason there is beer in Japan and in China and places like that is that the Germans had a presence there and they brewed beer because that's what the Germans do. But also, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, and this naval rivalry. Now, the Germans are going to be unique. They're going to focus on a little thing called an Unterwasserboot, an underwater boat, or a U-boat, which is a submarine. And they are going to basically have a control of that area of the war. Now, we're not going to go in to necessarily a bunch of the issues of what drags people into the war, but what drags the United States into the war eventually in 1917 is that the Germans will use unrestricted submarine warfare. And they will basically just sink any ship that is sailing towards Europe with their submarines. The Russians, they have what we call a pan-Slavic nationalism. They support Serbia because of this. Their nationalism is more about the Slavic subset, I guess you could say, or the Slavic. I hate to use the word race. It's problematic. It doesn't necessarily explain it, but the Slavic ancestry, we could say. And that is what they are promoting. There is a huge romanticization of World War I. The idea that war is how you prove yourself to be a man. It's your patriotic duty to fight a war. And the public, for the most part, when the war breaks out, now the public opinion will quickly change because this is going to be a very brutal and horrible war. But the public opinion when the war first breaks out is that the war's good. Yay! War! It's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be fighting. I mean, the European nations have fought each other for a really long time. And, you know, all this nationalism and the propaganda, the patriotism, the rivalries, the historic rivalries, it means that there's no real diplomatic solution available. These countries are ready to go to war and they are ready to fight. And then they find themselves bogged down into a massive conflict that they really don't want to be bogged down in anymore. They are going to justify their aggressiveness based upon this concept of nationalism, that we have a right and a duty to defend our country. So we're going to. Now let's move on to part 3 here, the impact of military technology. This is a very important aspect of the war. People should have looked toward the Russo-Japanese conflict to understand what this war would look like. One of the biggest things that we're going to see is that there will be an arms race between the great powers of Europe, trying to build up navies, trying to build up armies, and people will be conscripted, drafted, is another way of saying that. And there's going to be this very militarized idea of existence, not only in Europe, but especially in Japan. And, you know, I haven't really talked too much about Japan, but Japan is over there kind of doing its own thing. It's looming. And obviously, in a couple decades, it's going to be a major problem for the United States of America and what's going to bring us into World War II. As we talk about technological innovations, machine guns. I mean, there's a pretty, it's a kind of a sappy movie, but there's a movie called War Horse, a Disney movie. And there's a scene where the British go charging toward the German, encampment. And then these German machine guns just unleash upon the British horseback soldiers. And they're just no match. You are also going to have the creation of massive artillery, shelling. This is, now we call it PTSD, but this is the war that really, really brings about the concept of post-traumatic stress syndrome, or they would call it at the time shell shock, which is there's so much artillery going off that you think about it in your sleep, you can't sleep, you're nervous constantly. There's also the use of poison gas, blinding people during this war. Now, there were tanks, not a whole lot. Don't let video games, if you've played video games in the past about World War I, think there were tanks everywhere. There weren't a whole lot. But it was starting to become more prevalent. You do have the first use of airplanes really in war, mostly for reconnaissance, but there were dogfights. Obviously, there weren't really bombers or anything like that at this point. Guys might drop handheld bombs out of a plane, but it really wasn't too massive. And as I've also mentioned, submarines. The German submarines were a huge aspect of this war. Now, a lot of those technological advancements that I talked about with artillery, machine guns, poison gas, etc., lead us down a pathway to what is known as trench warfare. And trench warfare is absolutely atrocious. This is not like a World War II movie where guys are up and charging and shooting and everything else. This is you pop your head out of the hole in the trench, you shoot, maybe you advance forward a few feet, but you're really just kind of stuck in a trench and you're living there. And if you stick your head up and there happens to be a sniper, you might be dead. Also, you're living in a trench. Now, you guys know, you've all been kids before, you've probably dug a hole. If you dig a hole into the ground, what happens? It starts to get wet and moist. And so these trenches were cold, damp. There were rats, disease. It was absolutely awful. Imagine if you've ever worn a wet shoe or a sock for too long and you know how your foot starts to shrivel up. Imagine doing that for days upon days. Your foot starts to rot away. It's a thing called trench foot. It's absolutely gross. And this is how people were fighting this war. It was for feet at a time. One trench to another trench. It was utter madness. They started this war with this grand idea that it's going to be these battlefields of armies standing across from each other, like you might think of a Civil War movie. Like here's one army on one side and the other army on the other side, and they shoot at each other. That doesn't work when guys have machine guns and high-powered rifles and artillery. So all that glamour, if you will, of war goes away. And what you're left with is the horrors of war. Clouds of gas. Guys dying in the trench next to you. While a trench might give you somewhat of a safeguard from an artillery shell, it's not 100%. The stench of death during this war. And not just from humans. Human can put a gas mask on. A cow, a horse, a mule can't. Gas, the poison gas, if the battlefield was wet, and let's say there was a poison gas attack, the gas would go into the puddles. And if you landed face down in a puddle, you were face down in a pile of gas. It's gross. You would die. The moaning of animals slowly dying. This was a reality that quickly sat in. The glamour, the idea of fighting and dying for your country was gone. Now you were just dying. The killing in this war was massive. Battle of the Verdun and the Somme was hell on earth. Armies were trying to use old school tactics in the face of modern weapons. Yes, would there be developments in technology because of war? Yes, there always is. The reason why you have a microwave oven in your home is because of World War II, basically. But this was a horrible conflict. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, sometimes on a single day. The nationalism was great until it started to result in death. All right, there will be a brief part 3 where we will talk about the end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles.